there's hundreds of examples, right? Really plentiful of examples in Chinese recent history and in the PRC history. The Chinese people are willing to take on enormous amount of distress and trauma following their leadership if the narrative is convincing enough. And I think the thing that we should not forget, and this is something for our audience who's now very familiar with the Russian sort of dimension of international security challenges. Once you have someone like Putin in Russia, who for the last 30 years has been telling his own people a certain narrative about where Russia should be, where former Soviet states should be in that narrative, then how this is translating into a capacity to withstand sanction, international condemnation, and incredible amount of casualties. Then the next question is, well, what has Xi Jinping been doing? Well, you look at what Xi Jinping has been doing with the reform on the patriotic education, the way in which the system has been creeping into everyday's life, even in the last 4 years with the COVID-0 policy and the amount of distress and impositions that the average person has been taking on. I think it would be wishful thinking to assume. I think you are absolutely right when you say, like, am I trying to reassure myself? I think there is a lot of, like, we're trying to reassure ourselves that that demographic factor would make a difference. Not because people don't care about their children, but because people have to put a priority in that kind of context on the leadership that is leading them into the right direction.
So with deep regret, I'm going to pop a blob of red on the island of Taiwan.
Right. So here the key question from my perspective, James. I think we really need to sort of think about timelines, what I call the strategic timeline, because it is a trigger if it lasts longer than a few weeks. Because as we've seen in Ukraine, again, not because Ukraine and Taiwan are similar, the geography is completely different. If you think about it, the whole of Taiwan is about a third of the Donbas region.
Right. I didn't know that. Wow.
So we're talking about, a little more, but it's like roughly, right? So you put 2.5 Taiwans into the Donbas region to make the Donbas region, roughly, give it or take. So it's a very different terrain, but it is a very small terrain with Afghanistan kind of features, because about almost 30-something%, it's a spine of mountains that separates east from west, and these are like thick, tall mountains. It's like having the Alps in a very small space. And if you are Beijing, you know that you are looking at the map there, right? You have overwhelming capabilities. You have first move advantage in a way that nobody else does.
Yes.
What it is that you want to try to achieve. You don't want to force blue side to make a choice to come in and push back. So that strategic timeline, if the Chinese are successful in invading Taiwan and in particular capture the capital, in the way that the Russians never were, right? Well, then you're in a very different game, right? Because then the question for the United States is, what do we do? And that could be a very short-lived type of endeavor. But let's assume that the fight drags on, that the command and control structure in Taiwan become dispersed, and part of the fight is distributed further inland, where the Chinese would have serious trouble getting control of things. If no other reason, try to smoke out people in the mountains in that part of the world. Really complicated. The Taiwanese would be able to, if they were to switch into a type of insurgency, which would be very difficult because the core of the national population in Taiwan is concentrated over Taiwan, Tainan, and Taipei, which are coastal area, very flat. But let's assume again that they are pushing back, then the Chinese would be in a very difficult position.
So just so I've got my head around the military realities, are you saying that although it's a much smaller geography, the complexity of the terrain means that it may take months, and Peter was clear, it would be bloody, but it may take months for Xi to succeed, and that Peter made the point that the US might not be able to mobilize fast enough. But I wonder, was he suggesting that the US couldn't mobilise fast enough in order to deter the crossing of the strait in the first place, or couldn't mobilise fast enough to influence the success of the Chinese campaign on the island once begun?
That's a very good question. So I think it would be less fun, but there's a different version of this in which we're focusing on the D minus, or for the audience listening to us, it's sort of the deterrence space, right? Because the Chinese are getting all the pieces in place, civilian, military, the so-called military-civilian fusion, which is basically they're trying to as it happened in authoritarian regimes, you have more control over more levers of national power. So whether it is ferry boats that currently link the coast of Fujian to Matsu, Kinmen, and even Taiwan, which can be re-engineered for the purpose of military operations, right? So the Chinese are moving in a direction to get ready, but they're not quite there yet. So if we put our foot down, blue side, which is exactly what the United States is trying to do with the Philippines, with Japan, and Peter was absolutely right. We're thinking in terms of this as a single issue. But at the moment, we have North Korea that, through the links with Russia in light of Ukraine, is getting access to new technology for their own missile and nuclear program. And that's a problem in itself. Also advancing their submarine program capability. So leaving all the potential other crises that you might deal between now and then, I think the deterrence space is one in which is going to be determinant in not so much preventing things from happening, but on the day Xi Jinping is consuming breakfast and thinking like today is the day, that is when you'll have a little bit of space to making things like maybe not today, right? But assuming that they have the confidence, they would probably go all in. It would be bloody because they would try to seize control and decapitate the centers of power and have as a follow-up a positioning in the main urban areas. And that definitely would be Taoyuan and Taipei, because if you seize control in these two spaces, then you're done. However, if the Taiwanese then push back, then you're in for months-long grinding battle.
Yes.
For the United States, I think that would open up options. A, to degrade directly Chinese capabilities to retain superiority in certain spaces,
yes,
certainly in the air domain.
Yes.
But also open up options because the eastern part of Taiwan is very difficult to access land-wise. There's a couple of highways that get you the other side. Otherwise, you have to go through the Bashi Channel or Luzon, in which case you would have to have that first island chain control and confidence to actually close it and envelope it. Otherwise, you can have actually support coming in east-west. It would be difficult. It would require some degree of contested airspace. But as we know from the experience in the Black Sea and in relatively concentrated theaters, you can actually contest a space if the other side does not have proper air superiority.
Someone said to me, remember that the fighting age men in the PLA right now are the product of the one-child era. And he just speculated to me that if you've got a whole load of only child sons fighting in the PLA, that bloody war could cost Xi the consent of the Chinese public. Am I seeking reassurance where there is actually none?
I would be less convinced by that kind of argument. It's a lot of putting our rationality onto them and saying, and therefore they're irrational. I don't think that that's quite true in the same way it's not true in Russia with their huge losses that they've had in Ukraine or in the Middle East or elsewhere, where, you have fathers, knowing that their only son who's 5-year-old is going to go off and fight in a jihad and be dead by the time he's 19. I mean, there are other ways of looking at war than simply our Western one. Yeah. And I think this is one of the key failures and restrictions that we place in some of our Western thinking, in that we really hope, we believe that others think about their children, about their societies in the same way, and they don't. It's a very different way of Chinese thinking than it is from Japanese thinking or Indonesian thinking. I mean, they are very different. I don't honestly believe that we will ever see a sort of Chinese mass revolution rise up against the CCP. I'd be very surprised if it happens within our lifetime, but Alessio might have a completely different view.